Contrast with what we saw last week in Charlottesville, the protesters and the police, they're chanting together, Boston strong. You've been on the scene. What can you tell us?
And Jim, quite the contrast after those pictures were shot. There was quite the tense moment here, but an immediate change when one of the Boston top officials arrived here and essentially requested some of these officers pulled back. And then the conversation began, Jim. And the man who was in the middle of the conversation, Police Superintendent William Gross. Yeah. Chief, you came out here. You had this discussion with people after what was a fairly tense moment.
People were very passionate.
And what was the outcome?
The outcome is positive dialogue. What we took away from here today, we talked about a victory that we had on the Boston Commons. That we stood together as a city, and especially the youth of the city, some are standing around, thank you, my brother, and we took away a victory that we told people that are racist, that are hate mongers, that this is not accepted in Boston. And you saw many nations together today combating racism. So when it got contentious, I saw a lot of the folks in the audience there in the crowd that I knew from the streets. And so I simply went up and asked, like, what's wrong, right? And then they said, we just want to walk through. So I had the officer step back, and then I talked to the people I knew and other people that I had just learned of. And we talked about take away of victory today, that in Boston, as you look around, nothing's burning, nothing's stolen, nothing's looted, that the young people of Boston, their parents, their loved ones, and especially the young people of Boston, you know, this is a victory today to stand together and drive away racism. Anything negative that happened, that's unfortunate. But there was victories today. There were victories, and we need to work on everything else now that we found that common ground. The mayor, the commissioner, the city councils, the clergy, and we will not forget the youth today. Y'all brought it. That's the victory, having the dialogue after a victory to fix things for the future.
Chief Gross, really do appreciate you taking some time.
Thank you. Now that I know you're not one of the kids, you know, thank you. But
thank
see
you,
these
Chief.
brothers here, y'all brought it today. Thank you.
That clearly is an indication again, Jim. We have seen that conversation that's happening. Things did take a turn. The police chief did speak about some of the negatives. Yes, some officers did get hurt, some minor injuries. Yes, some arrests were made. But ultimately, this is where it all ended in a positive way. And as the chief admitted, still things need to be learned. And of course, people need to move forward. Taking a lot from this moment, Jim.
Polo, we know you're not one of the kids, but I think it does. I think it is worth taking a moment and just appreciating what the police superintendent said to you there a few moments ago,
right,
when this really could have unraveled, where this could have just been a repeat of what happened in Charlottesville a week ago. The country has just been weighed down with this heavy atmosphere after the president misfired earlier this week on all of this badly. To see people come together and chanting with the police, Boston strong, and the police superintendent to come out there and say that everything turned out all right in a major U.S. city when the elements were there, that we could have had big trouble. Polo, that's a great interview there. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. We appreciate it.
You bet, Jim. No problem.
All right. Thank you, Polo. The president tweeted earlier about the protests in Boston, and this is worth noting now. He wrote, quote, "Looks like many anti-police agitators in Boston. Police are looking tough and smart. Thank you." I guess the president missed the protesters singing and chanting with the police there. We should point out, he did reverse course later on in the afternoon and tweeted this: "I want to applaud the many protesters in Boston who are speaking out against bigotry and hate. Our country will soon come together as one." It's worth noting all of this because the president said earlier this week he likes having all of the facts before speaking. That obviously was not the case earlier today when he tweeted about anti-police protesters and agitators. So here are the facts straight from the Boston Police Commissioner.
Overall, again, everyone did a good job. 99.9% of the people here were for the right reason, and that's to fight bigotry and hate for the most part here today.
All right, let's bring in our panel. Joining us, CNN political commentator and KABC talk radio host John Phillips, political commentator and former spokesperson for Breitbart News, Kurt Bardella. And here with me in New York, CNN political commentator, op-ed columnist for the New York Times, the great Charles Blow. John Phillips, let me go to you first. You heard the Boston Police Commissioner there and the superintendent, who was just phenomenal there a few moments ago, talking about how everything turned out right. But the commissioner is saying that 99.9% of the people there today for this protest were there for the right reasons. Yet the president's gut reaction, as we saw last week in Charlottesville, his gut reaction is sometimes tone deaf. He talked about anti-police agitators. What happened to waiting for the facts, John?
Jim, I don't know if you've ever noticed this in any of your interactions with the president, but he has a bit of an ego and considers himself to be a counterpuncher. So my guess is the president turned the TV on this morning and saw some signs that were unkind to him and saw some scuffles with the cops, and that was the counterpunch that came out. He watched some more TV, saw the rally was relatively nonviolent, then saw the mayor and the police commissioner say everything was A-OK, and you saw the subsequent tweets, which I think were accurate and should be celebrated, because anytime you have the vile incident that we had last week in Charlottesville, the best way to handle horrific speech is to do it with more free speech and to show that we can be better, to show that we can make arguments that denounce these racists and Klansmen and white supremacists, which is what you saw today. I think today is a good day that should be celebrated.
Absolutely. Kurt, do you think the president missed an opportunity to turn the tide today? He seemed a bit off in his tone in that initial tweet talking about anti-police agitators. And then a few moments ago, we're showing video of the protesters and the police officers chanting Boston Strong together. What do you make of that?
You know, Jim, it's almost as if this president is rooting for conflict, rooting for divisiveness, rooting for violence, rooting for anything that will somehow justify his completely unjustifiable remarks last week with everything that happened in Charlottesville. And it just shows that this isn't a president who cares about getting the facts. It's not a president who cares about actually learning what happened and paying attention. It's a president who's all about trying to find a way to frame everything through his narrow-minded lens to try to justify everything that he says and does, most of which is completely unfactual, most of which derives from information that is either twisted or turned or completely devoid of reality. That's just Donald Trump. And it shows also that this isn't about all the ruckus about Steve Bannon. Donald Trump is Donald Trump, and nothing is going to change with Bannon gone. And we saw that with just the tweet that he launched today.
And Charles, I mean, to me, this moment says it all. This video of the police with the protesters, they're hugging, they're embracing. Such a contrast with what we saw in Charlottesville a week ago. And yet the president just can't seem to get it right. What do you make of this?
Well, I mean, the presidency reveals you, right? I mean, the spotlight is always on you, every move you make, everything that you say, and you cannot hide who you are. Eventually, whoever that is, for good or ill, it will be revealed. And we are seeing patterns develop from him as president. Forget what he did before, but just as president. He's slow to condemn violence against minorities, against Jews, against Muslims. He's slow to condemn the alt-right and white supremacists. He is quick to condemn, even when he is wrong, people who he assumes are Muslims, Black Lives Matter, people who he assumes are against him. He's quick. And like you said, he digs himself a hole because he's very, very often wrong.
Does he get any credit for reversing course later on in the afternoon and saying, well, it's time to come together and heal? I know he misspelled heal at first.
No, I just don't think so, because as it was reported on television, he literally made that tweet, at least it was reported that way, while the press conference was going on, when the police officer stepped to the mic and said, this went well, right? So there's something profoundly flawed in the man. There's a character issue here. There's a morality cavity where your impulses do not align with what we expect a moral man to be. Even if we disagree on policies, I vehemently disagree with his policies, but I do expect each president to have a sort of moral compass that leads you to at least articulate the right things and to reach out to the rest of the country. This idea of constantly saying his base and him saying his base and him having political rallies, there's something wrong about that, because the election's over. We'll have another one for 4 years. At this point, you have to rise above it and say, you may not like me, you may not believe me, you may not have voted for me, but I am your president, so I'm going to do my best. And
John Phillips, what do you make of that? Charles Blow is saying that the president just lacks a moral compass, that he doesn't know how to respond to situations like this because it's just not in him.
Well, I spoke to someone who talked to the president recently, and the president thought that his initial statement was a universal condemnation and was caught by surprise when it was met with outrage and people were criticizing him, which is then when you saw the statement that came out on Monday, and then you saw the angry press conference on Tuesday when he felt that he was under attack. When he feels like he's under attack, and we've seen many of these stories with the same beats, he digs in his heels and fights back. And it becomes less about the issue of whatever it is that we're talking about and more about him fighting with the media or fighting with his critics.
Well, I certainly know that all too well. Kurt, let me turn to you. Before Steve Bannon was fired yesterday, the president was in for a terrible news cycle. The mother of Heather Heyer was saying she didn't want to meet with him. Mitt Romney was saying he should apologize to the country. What do you think the White House should do about all of that? Obviously, the Bannon news, whether it was a distraction or whether he was supposed to be fired yesterday, that's all going to go away. He still has to deal with this issue where he just failed everybody when it came to Charlottesville, and as we saw earlier today, he still can't seem to get it right.
Well, I think if the president really wants to try to hit the reset button, he's going to have to completely change his approach, both to dealing with these national moments and opportunities to demonstrate leadership and some sort of moral leadership, but also in how he engages policymakers on Capitol Hill, actually trying to be bipartisan, actually being engaged in the policy process. So much of the lack of action on his agenda, whether it was trying to repeal and replace Obamacare, get tax reform done, infrastructure, it's because he's completely MIA in any of these conversations. Other than sending some tweets out, he doesn't actually engage. He doesn't talk with congressional leadership. He doesn't talk with policymakers. There's such a lack of substance to Donald Trump. It is alarming, and it's the reason why he can't get any traction and get actually any legislative accomplishments. I think if he wants to try to hit the reset button, get some momentum for his presidency, he's going to have to abandon this catering to the alt-right and actually reach across the aisle and try to get something done.
And yet, as we understand, gentlemen, he has some campaign-style rallies coming up later on next week. My sense is that that reset button is being put off to the side. He's going to continue to go back to the base, maybe push the reset button with the base over and over and over again. Charles Blow, Kurt Bardella, John Phillips, thanks so much. We appreciate it. And amid the fallout from Charlottesville and a growing rift within the Republican Party, House Speaker Paul Ryan takes part in a live CNN town hall. Do not miss this.
President Trump's comments about white supremacists earlier this week. It's not the first time that he's been accused of espousing racist views. Take a look.
Look, I feel strongly about the fact that Barack Obama should give his birth certificate. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. He's a Mexican. We're building a wall between here and Mexico.
Will you unequivocally condemn David Duke and say that you don't want his vote or that of other white supremacists in this election?
Well, just so you understand, I don't know anything about David Duke, okay? I don't know anything about what you're even talking about with white supremacy or white supremacists.
Joining us, someone who knows President Trump more than most, CNN contributor and Donald Trump biographer, Michael D'Antonio. His book is called The Truth About Trump. Michael, would you call President Trump a racist?
Well, you know, we can't look directly into his heart, but his record is dotted with racist remarks and sentiments going all the way back to when he was very young, had joined his father's firm and complained about reverse discrimination, which was an absurd concept because he didn't want to comply with fair housing laws. And even the clip you just played about David Duke, he spoke at length about David Duke 17 years before, when he was thinking of running in the Reform Party for president, and then backed out and complained that it was because the Reform Party had guys in it like David Duke. So this is a long established record. The thing I always go back to with Donald Trump is that he's one of the most isolated people I've ever encountered. I've never met someone who lived his whole life in such privilege, but also such isolation, where he rarely came into contact with people different from him. And really, he never came much in contact with anyone who would disagree with him. He talks about soliciting input all over the place, but everyone he has taken input from over the years happens to have been dependent on him for a paycheck. So
you're speaking of a lack of diversity in his life and exposure to that diversity. And you have a new CNN op-ed I want people to know about so they can go and read it. But let me just quote a portion of it. You write, as Donald Trump Jr. told me, the family believes in the racehorse theory of human development, which holds that they are superior to others by virtue of genetics. Explain that.
Well, right. And the president himself told me that he had a genetic gift for real estate, whatever that means. You know, I think that they have this strange concept that simply by virtue of being born a Trump, you're superior in judgment and intelligence. The way that Donald Trump Jr. put it to me was that if you put together a really great woman and a really great man, and he was really talking about breeding, as you would breed horses, you're going to get a really great offspring. Now, this is something that all people around the world categorically reject as racist. You know, there's no evidence that there's any difference from group to group in terms of intelligence and abilities. So it's a very noxious view, but it's something that I think Donald Trump has carried with him through life, and it affects everything that he says and does. So when we heard him speak last week, the third time, you know, the first two times he was hesitant and unclear, but the last time he made it very clear how he feels. And he, you know, the thing that really struck me there too is he didn't want to talk about moral differences. He said, I'm not putting anyone on a moral plane.
Do you think he understands the moral differences? I mean, do you think he understands why people were offended by his comments?
You know, I think he does. I think deep down he does. He's not a stupid guy. He's smart enough. He's been reading the newspaper for 45 or 50 years. He's an avid consumer of news. He knows we went through a civil rights revolution in this country where equality became expected and became the norm. So for him to talk about there being equal moral status for people espousing racism and people espousing acceptance is, you know, he knows what he's doing. He's pandering to the people he identifies as his base. It's a very small number of people, as we saw in Boston today, but he's pandering.
Well, since Charlottesville, a lot of people have said that wasn't okay. A lot of people have abandoned the president. CEOs, executives started resigning from his councils, forcing him to end at least a couple of them. The Arts and Humanities Committee resigned. At least 15 charities have canceled events at Mar-a-Lago. The mother of the young woman killed in Charlottesville, Heather Heyer's mother, she says she doesn't even want to speak to the president. Do you think any of that bothers him?
Well, I think it must. I don't think that you can be rejected so roundly and not be affected and not take it in. And certainly his children and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, they understand what's going on here. The problem with the president is that the more he's pushed, the more he digs in. And so it's a very self-defeating thing. Now that he's isolated in the White House without really friends in Congress, really no friends in the business world, how is he going to accomplish anything? And of greater concern for all of us is how is the government to function? You know, how can we rely on stability in our government when he doesn't seem to be able to move in any direction successfully?
All right, Michael D'Antonio, thanks as always for joining us.
Thank you, Anna.
Near Richmond, Virginia today, a state policeman who lost his life while supporting police during last weekend's Charlottesville rally was laid to rest. This was the public memorial service this morning for Lieutenant Jay Cullen. He and a state police pilot were both killed last Saturday when their police helicopter crashed in a wooded area near Charlottesville. Virginia's governor spoke at the service.
Today, we lost a member of our family. Dorothy and I are heartbroken. It'll never be the same when I step into that helicopter and not see Jay in that front right seat with Cullen on the back of his helmet.
Back in Charlottesville, the man charged with murdering a woman by driving his car into a crowd of counter-protesters last weekend now has a stack of new charges. I'm talking about James Alex Fields. He's already charged with second-degree murder and several counts of malicious wounding in that horrific crash where 32-year-old Heather Heyer was killed. CNN's Rosa Flores joins us from Charlottesville. Rosa, tell us more about these new charges this man is facing and what's next in the case.
You know, Anna, we are learning more about these additional charges. These are 5 felony counts, including 2 counts of malicious wounding, 3 counts of aggravated malicious wounding. And of course, these stack up onto all the counts that he's already facing, which include second-degree murder, 3 counts of malicious wounding, and 1 count of hit and run. Now, we are following his case very closely, of course. We know that he is sitting in a county jail right now. No bond has been set. A bond hearing is pending, and he has been appointed a public defender. Now, we do know that this individual is the former county prosecutor, so someone with a lot of experience, and his next hearing is set for August 25th. Anna.
Rosa, you also have something new to report about Christopher Cantwell, I understand, the white nationalist that was so prominently featured in that Vice News special in Charlottesville. What is that?
Indeed, CNN learning from a senior law enforcement source familiar with this investigation that other warrants have been issued, including, like you mentioned, for Christopher Cantwell. He is the white nationalist, who was featured very prominently in that Vice News special report. And he said many racist things, many racist tirades in that special report, including saying that the death of Heather Heyer was very much justified. Now, as you know, Heather Heyer is a 32-year-old woman who was rammed by a car and killed, and by that same vehicle, 19 other people were also wounded. As for the warrants, though, according to this law enforcement source, these warrants have been issued, but they have not been served.
All right, Rosa Flores reporting for us in Charlottesville tonight. Thank you. President Trump has been criticized for not fully renouncing the extremist groups whose rally last weekend triggered the violence in Charlottesville. But CNN found many of the president's supporters are agreeing with him. Here's Bryn Gingras near Lexington, Kentucky.
To every action, there is a reaction.
Trump supporter Eddie Platt agrees with the president. Both sides are to blame for the deadly unrest in Charlottesville, Virginia.
There's no clear thing on who was the first provocation.
His view is not unique in Paris, Kentucky, just 14 miles outside Lexington.
Where I come from, 2 wrongs don't make a right. You got the left and the right in the country. Well, whatever happened to the middle?
There was fault on both sides, but
both sides, right? One side
right.
He called the alt-left.
Right.
Those people are fighting for equality.
Yes, right.
The alt-right fighting for white supremacy,
Yeah.
to take over the country as a white-only America.
I think they have a right to protest the white supremacists.
Even with carrying torches and shields. What did you think about that?
Whatever they carry, but they have a right to protest.
How can you hold one person responsible for all the fighting? It's what people, I think it's just what people believe in, and that's what they're taught.
Here in Bourbon County, voters overwhelmingly supported Trump in last year's election. They're concerned about racism in this country, but they don't think the president is at fault for any of the divisiveness.
Some of the best friends I've got are black people. I served on the city commission.
But does it worry you?
17 years, and the black people here elected me.
You say some of the people, but closest friends are black people, right? But there are people in Virginia marching saying that black people can't replace them, Jewish people can't replace them.
The ones that can't get their thirst quenched are making the other black people look bad. Those white people that have put a swastika on their arm in March or a Ku Klucker, they're making a white man look bad.
Can turn into a war between the blacks and the whites. And
you think a civil war could happen?
I mean, honestly, I've thought that.
As for white supremacy,
do you think the president has given them more of a voice?
I don't think so. I think the president is in a tough position.
If they put people back to work, that alone will solve a lot of problems. Poverty breeds a lot of trouble.
He needs to stand up and call the people out by what they are He needs to say this is not going to be tolerated in the United States.
Is there anything the president could do where you draw the line?
You know, then again, if he would come in and say, "Hey, I'm not letting you protest. I'm not letting you white supremacists. This is not going to happen anymore," or I'm going to not let that you people that are protesting for equality. I'm not letting that happen anymore. What would that do for our rights as the United States in this country? This is a melting pot. This is the United States of America. We all need to come together.
These people say they love their country, and that's why they support the presidency. So 7 months into this administration, they say they see some problems, but not enough to sway their support. Bryn Gingras, CNN, Paris, Kentucky.
Thanks, Bryn. Coming up, the CEO president is being abandoned by big business of all people, gutting 2 White House economic counsels in the wake of his remarks following Charlottesville. Carl Icahn out as a presidential advisor as well. Will anyone else emerge from Wall Street to help the president? You're live in the CNN newsroom. Tweeting about this just moments ago. Looks like many anti-police agitators in Boston police are looking tough and smart. Thank you. Moments later, he tweeted, "Great job by all law enforcement officers and Boston Mayor Marty Walsh." For more on the march and rally, CNN correspondent Sarah Seidner is joining us from Boston. Sarah, still looks like a large crowd behind you there. Give us a sense of the people who have shown up. Would you describe them as anti-police agitators?
No, there are people here who actually, I saw someone who worked for the mayor's office who was out here as well. There are people here from all different walks of life. And the people who organize this, like Black Lives Matter and some other groups, you know, if you talk to many of the Black Lives Matter advocates, there are lots of people saying we're not anti-police, we're anti-police brutality. So that's one thing that should differentiate them. But also there are a lot of people here who are here because they are very concerned about what is happening in the country, especially after what the country and the world saw happening in Charlottesville. Because of that, that is what you're seeing, such a large crowd, and it really is a diverse crowd. Were there some taunts towards police? Yes. Were there a few people who were yelling and screaming? Yes. But as a whole, there were thousands of people who showed up, and their message was, we shouldn't be silent. We have to stand up against white supremacy and stand up against racism. And that is what you're seeing now. There is a crowd, a smaller crowd that is now in the street here at Tremont Street, but they are here, and the police came through them, and they sort of went past them, and this group has gotten a bit smaller, but they are standing in the street.
Oh, we gotta go. We gotta get off the truck.
We're being sort of moved off the truck now, so we're going to kind of get down for you at this point in time.
All right, Sarah, we'll check back with you. Keep us updated on what's happening again in Boston. Largely peaceful protest happening there at this hour. Activism on the streets isn't the only backlash we're seeing after Charlottesville. The Trump administration is also under siege. In the last week alone, President Trump has been forced to disband 3 of his advisory councils after members began leaving. His Committee on Arts and Humanities is the very latest, disbanding just the day or so ago. More than a dozen charities have also canceled events at Trump's ritzy Mar-a-Lago club. And yesterday, billionaire Carl Icahn stepped down as an advisor to the president. Joining us, CNN presidential historian Douglas Brinkley, CNN contributor, and Washington Post reporter David Fahrenthold, CNN political commentator and former lieutenant governor of South Carolina, Andre Bauer, and former chairman of the Washington, D.C. Democratic Party, A. Scott Bolden. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me. Douglas, I want to start with you. Help us understand and contextualize this moment. Is there anything we can compare it to in the past?
Well, Donald Trump has done something that no president has ever done before, which is just kind of incite the country, unified people. I mean, so many Republicans have, joined forces with Democrats. You have people bailing on Mar-a-Lago. You have Kennedy Center for Arts winners saying they won't show up if the president's there. Athletes don't want to go to the White House. He's become the pariah president, and Charlottesville seems to me to be the tipping point. It's a point that's sort of mobilizing the anti-Trump opposition, and Trump now forever in history is going to be associated with very far right-wing extremist, even white supremacist policies because of his bungling of Charlottesville.
David, you broke the reporting about all these charities now pulling events from Mar-a-Lago. I think the latest number was 16. Are they canceling specifically because of the president's response to Charlottesville?
Well, a lot of them have not mentioned the word Charlottesville in their response, but it's clear from the timing of these cancellations that's what did it. This is all a wave that happened since the middle of last week. So after Charlottesville, a couple of days later, the Cleveland Clinic, based in Ohio, they canceled their charity. Since then, there's been 8 more, including one today. It's reached even to the charities that are just based in Palm Beach, kind of in this social bubble where Trump remains relatively popular. A big Palm Beach charity canceled just a few minutes ago. So it's been a pretty big wave of those charities depriving his club of quite a lot of money.
How much of a financial hit is this for the president?
Well, it depends on whether these folks get their deposit back or not. But each one of these galas could be between $100,000 and $275,000 in fees for Trump's club, just one for each night. So if for all these things, 9 galas in all have canceled, in addition to a couple of luncheons, we're looking at $1 million or more for Trump's club. It's a significant amount of money.
Again, we're continuing to monitor the protests on the ground there in Boston. These are images from overhead. And let me turn to you, A. Scott, the president tweeting about these protests just within the last hour. He writes, quote, "Looks like many anti-police agitators in Boston. Police are looking tough and smart. Thank you. Great job by all law enforcement officers in Boston Mayor Marty Walsh." What's your response to that?
Well, based on your reporting, certainly there are not a lot of police agitators there. As a matter of fact, Boston police officers have done a really good job at keeping the protesters apart. But Donald Trump, as a super narcissist, as someone who supports, at least sympathizes or reports this racism, this hatred, this bigotry, all he knows is to fight and to put your finger on the wrong button to create some type of chaos or adversity, if you will. Instead of being the healer-in-chief, the consoler-in-chief, he's the agitator-in-chief. And until he figures out that he's not representing himself, that he's representing all of us, or at least is supposed to, you're going to get these tweets that simply agitate. Black Lives Matter is there. They've been nonviolent. No issues there. Only 8 people were arrested. But why were they there? They were there standing up to racism, hatred, and bigotry. What brought them there was racism, hatred, and bigotry. And what we saw the president do last Tuesday was support racism, bigotry, and hatred. And that's why you have the organizations, nonprofits, and otherwise pulling out of anything connected to him, because it's not in mainstream America. America wants to be better, but Donald Trump won't let it. And simply because you're the president and you got elected doesn't mean you've got to take us back. You've got to move us forward, and he simply is incapable of doing that.
Andre, there have been thousands of people who've turned out today, and they were protesting against hate, according to our Sarah Seidner and other reporters on the ground, mostly peaceful there. There have been a handful, a little bit more than a handful, of arrests made today. But is this the right response days after being accused of defending white nationalists?
You know, we know this is a difficult time in our history, and, you know, I worry as to what these mayors have to make a decision. You know, it's almost as if we need some clause that says, look, we believe in freedom of speech, but when we believe that freedom of speech is getting ready to harm people, there needs to be some way for them to pump the brakes. When rioters are showing up in better gear than what the police officers have, most of those folks don't have the intentions that the average citizen does, that just shows up to be vocal and to let their feelings be known. We have people that are actually showing up in gear better than what folks like myself that are 15-year-plus police officers. It's concerning, and a few people can really mess up freedom of speech for everyone because they're out there to do more than just speak.
Yeah, a few people could do that, and by all accounts, it sounds like it was just a little more than a few people who were causing trouble out of thousands. So why is the president focusing on that and not sending out a message of peace and unity, and perhaps even cheering people who are protesting against hate?
Well, last Saturday, you were kind enough to have me on your show, and we talked about this very situation. And I said, you know, give him a couple days, and he'll be able to see the facts, and he'll go back, and he did that. Maybe he didn't do it.
And then he reversed again the next day.
I wish he had done it a little quicker, a little more concise. Again,
Andre, you're not answering my question. Do you approve of the way the president is now handling this situation today? Do you think that his tweet about anti-police protesters being the ones who showed up at this Boston protest today and focusing on that, sending that message out to the world, is the right tweet to send out?
You know, I try not to criticize. When President Obama was the president, I try not to criticize him on everything he did. It's easy to criticize people. unless you have an explanation of a better way to handle it, just to beat on somebody all the time, I don't think it's healthy for the system. I don't think it's healthy for the process. Clearly, if I were the president, I would have handled it differently, but I am not the president of the United States. And so there are things he could have done better, and hindsight's always better than it is looking in today's vantage point. But again, I think the president's been very fair and judicious in almost everything he said.
Hey, Scott, I know wanted to respond.
You do? Can I respond to that?
Go ahead.
I'd like to respond to that. So he's forced to say that he denounces the KKK and the neo-Nazis in 2017, forced to do that. Before that, he said it was a blame on all sides, as if there's some moral equivalent. And then Tuesday, he has a complete breakdown, if you will, and goes back to defending neo-Nazis and other hate groups. Hate speech is not free speech. I don't care what the Supreme Court says, quite frankly. And when you have the president supporting that nonsense, that's taking us backwards, not forwards. And Andre, as a Republican, as a statesman, you have an obligation and a duty as a member of the Republican Party to stand up, to criticize, because there is no choice. Good versus evil. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Your president is wrong. You ought to stand up and call him what it is, ask him to be better, or disassociate yourself from his support of hate speech, Nazis, bigotry, hatred, the Ku Klux Klan, profits in this, and you ought to stand up and say so.
So are you ignoring? But Andre, it seems like you're just ignoring what he said the very next day without a teleprompter. And he was very passionate, saying that there was violence on both sides and condemning both sides. He also said that there were very fine people on both sides. And we know very, very well who was on one side of that. And that was people who were white nationalists, KKK, neo-Nazis who were wandering around. What's not true?
There are people that showed up to protest that had no intention of violence whatsoever.
Exactly. A lot of those were the counter-protesters.
That's right.
On both sides, there were people with bad intentions and good intentions. And those few people with those intentions that were bad make everybody get painted with the same brush, but that's not the case. Not every single person that showed up to say, hey, we don't believe in taking this monument down, wanted it to be physical or violent. They just wanted to say they believe in something. And so to criticize all of them under the same blanket is not fair and it's not right.
Guys, I have other people with us, so let me...
Okay, Donald, that's enough fun for tonight. Can I have my desk back?
Yes, of course, Mr. President. I'll go sit at my desk.
He was portrayed as the Grim Reaper, the puppet master, and even as the brain behind Trump. But now Steve Bannon is out as White House chief strategist. I want to thank Steve Bannon for his service. He came to the campaign during my run against crooked Hillary Clinton. It was great. Thanks, S. That's what the president tweeted this morning. Sources now tell CNN Bannon believed he put the pieces in place for his agenda to live on without him in the White House, and he downplayed concern about his imminent firing, telling associates he would return to his, quote, killing machine, Breitbart. And late yesterday, we learned he did just that. Bannon telling the Weekly Standard, quote, I feel jacked up. Now I'm free. I've got my hands back on my weapons. Someone said, it's Bannon the Barbarian. I'm definitely going to crush the opposition. There's no doubt I built a bleeping machine at Breitbart, and now I'm about to go back knowing what I know, and we're about to rev that machine up, and rev it up we will do. Joining me now is CNN senior media reporter Oliver Darcy. So, Oliver, even though he was forced out, Bannon there saying he's going to go to war for the president. What are you learning now about the plans he and Breitbart may have moving forward?
Right. Well, one person at Breitbart told me that they're already, starting the motion of going to war for Trump, as Steve Bannon says, by basically targeting the individuals that Bannon clashed within the Oval Office. You're looking at Jared Kushner, Ivanka Trump, Dina Powell, General McMaster. And so those are the people I think we can look forward to in the next few weeks as Breitbart will start, kind of zeroing in on them and taking the battle to them.
So you really think that he is going to continue to defend the president? He doesn't have it out against him?
I'm not sure that we'll see Breitbart defend the president as much as we'll see Breitbart target the inner circle and say maybe, imply at least, that Trump's being misled by people who don't have his best interests at heart. And these are the things that Trump campaigned on, and we want him to follow through with his promises. We believe he wants to, but these people may be, not the best advisors. I think that's sort of the picture we'll see painted, and they'll target Jared Kushner and Gary Cohn and those individuals, saying that they're not giving him good advice.
Gotcha. So on the one hand, we have Bannon thinking his agenda is going to live on. On the other hand, he also said this to the Weekly Standard: the Trump presidency that we fought for and won is over. We still have a huge movement, and we will make something of this Trump presidency, but that presidency is over. It'll be something else, and there'll be all kinds of fights, and there'll be good days and bad days, but that presidency is over. So that emphasis on it is over, what does that mean?
I think, so there was a Breitbart editor the other day that was on TV, and he was saying that there's no real conservatives or populists in the White House anymore. If you look at the White House, it's certainly a little left-leaning. I mean, a lot of former Democrats are actually in the White House. So I think what Bannon's saying there is that, Trump was elected to be this nationalist, this populist, and the people he's surrounding himself with now don't really maybe hold those views or
but Trump
want to
makes
advance
the
that
decisions,
agenda.
as we all know. How often is he listening to all the people who are around him? Ultimately, we've heard over and over again, he is the decision maker. Really interesting, though, when you look at a picture taken very early on in this presidency. This is back in January in the Oval Office. It shows the president's original circle. And take a look very closely. All of them, with the exception of the vice president there, Mike Pence, are gone. Every White House we know has some turnover, but just how remarkable is what we're seeing right now at this stage in the presidency?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely stunning. I don't think anyone, I certainly didn't expect this much turnover. I think maybe we expected, Reince to be out, but particularly in the beginning, it seemed like Bannon had a lot of power, and everyone was talking about, wow, he's installed himself on the National Security Council. He seems to be implementing the Muslim ban, et cetera. And it's just really remarkable now, a few months later, to see him forced out of the White House as most of the original staff is just gone.
Total turnover. Oliver Darcy, thanks so much.
Thank you, Anna.
Coming up here in the newsroom, disturbing new video. It shows an officer beating an African-American driver after what seemed like a... Welcome back. The debate over the removal of Confederate monuments is growing increasingly ugly, and even criminal vandals have struck a number of memorials across the country. And just this morning, in fact, Duke University made the decision to remove a statue of General Robert E. Lee that had been defaced there. While the fight over removing these symbols is nothing new, it has been given new life in the wake of the deadly violence in Charlottesville. CNN's Nick Valencia reports.
It's not just in the South. This week across America, symbols and monuments to the Confederacy were either taken down or vandalized, sparking the fight over several hundred Confederate monuments and symbols. In Brooklyn, New York, groundskeepers outside the St. John's Episcopal Church removed 2 commemorative plaques for Confederate General Robert E. Lee. They were expected to be relocated to a church museum. Reactions were mixed.
Because of this man, 300,000 Americans were killed.
At some point, you got to move on, and you can't do stuff like this. This is crazy.
Earlier in the week in Durham, North Carolina, demonstrators toppled the statue of a Confederate soldier. 7 protesters were arrested. Out west in Arizona, state and local officials woke up Thursday to an extensively damaged Confederate monument along the Jefferson Davis Memorial Highway.
That's my family there.
People like David McAllister are trying to protect monuments like this one in his hometown of Tampa Bay. He leads a group called Save Southern Heritage.
Our agenda is the mainstream agenda of cherishing American history.
Elected officials in New Orleans recently removed several Confederate monuments. Mayor Mitch Landrieu thinks those who support them endorse oppression.
These monuments celebrate a fictional sanitized Confederacy, ignoring the death, ignoring the enslavement, ignoring the terror that it actually stood for.
Last week's deadly violence in Charlottesville, Virginia magnified the issue again. And in the wake of it all, the president's comments seem to only widen the gap between opposing sides.
I wonder, is it George Washington next week, and is it Thomas Jefferson the week after? You know, you really do have to ask yourself, where does it stop?
Nick Valencia, CNN, Atlanta.
So let's bring in CNN presidential historian Douglas Brinkley for a more in-depth conversation on all of this. So, Doug, these monuments, they will always be a part of American heritage. But as a historian, what do you think is accomplished